So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on CEO fraud. We're going to be looking at how an urgent request could cost you millions. I can see people are filtering in, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief introduction and a quick overview of today's agenda, by which time I think that everyone that intends on attending would have joined already. So, my name is Nick. I'm a data protection associate here at Tessian, where I work with clients to help secure their email systems from the risk of human error. So before joining Tessian, I founded a daily deals company and I worked at a global investment bank where I witnessed these advanced phishing attempts firsthand alongside other cybersecurity risks. And these differed greatly to each other from industry to industry. So from daily deals to a global investment bank, they really did differ. And it was obvious that attackers really do their homework, their research on each specific industry so that they're fully informed. Now, I thought it would be great to make the jump over into cybersecurity and tackle that problem firsthand and really get involved with something that I noticed was clearly an issue. Outside of work, I'm a massive Arsenal fan, massive fan of the football. At the moment, things probably aren't going so well. I'm sure if there are any Arsenal fans in the audience, you guys will know kind of how I'm feeling, and you won't be looking that hopefully towards our fixture on Saturday against Leicester. But let's see what happens there. So now that I've kind of got introductions out of the way, we can take a look at today's agenda and see what really we're going to be discussing. Now, firstly, we're going to take a look at what's at stake with CEO fraud. So, what is CEO fraud? How did CEO fraud come about, and what are the risks associated with it? Following that, we're going to take a look at the specific email tactics that attackers use when executing CEO fraud. How are the attackers impersonating CEOs? How are they impersonating senior level execs and coercing employees to engage in activity and make actions that they would not usually make? And following that, we're going to look at the current solutions that are available that are intended to protect organizations against internal impersonations such as CEO fraud. We're going to evaluate, are these solutions, are they working? How effective are they? And are they leaving organizations vulnerable? And based on this webinar and its attendance, I'd assume that they probably are, that you guys are here to learn about the effectiveness of solutions that you may have in place and potentially an alternative. And that brings me on to my final point. Lastly, we're going to look at machine learning, a potentially new solution that provides a new approach to dealing with such situations. And what I want to ask you guys is, how can you leverage your historical data to protect against these attacks? So that is essentially the question you should be asking, and machine learning is therefore the solution to that question. So firstly, what is at stake when it comes to CEO fraud? So actually, before we get into that, what's at stake specifically, let's just take a step back. Let's see how we got to this stage in the first place and how these issues came about. There's no denying that digitalization has transformed the enterprise, but let's take a look at that even deeper. What do I mean by that? So essentially, digitalization has been the single greatest value driver. So I'm sure you guys all have digitalized many aspects of your life. For example, doing your shopping online. We send contracts online. We hire staff online, and we now have HR processes that are digital as well. So digitalization has had a massive impact on the modern world and especially businesses. And this is emphasized by the fact that we've seen employee productivity increase by a whopping 73%. And alongside that, the S&P 500 value has increased by 715%, both from 1999 until 2013 and 2019 respectively. But whilst there certainly has been positives from digitalization, there certainly has also been unprecedented challenges. So what are the negative aspects that are associated with digitalization? So digitalization has essentially meant that the amount of data available and held by enterprises has increased dramatically. It's been predicted to have increased 175-fold between 2010 and 2025. So this vast increase in data by these organizations will undoubtedly increase the number of data breaches, which is supported by a 900% increase of such breaches between 2005 and 2017. So this kind of begs the question, how do we protect businesses from these cyber attacks? I mean, the question of how we protect businesses from these cyber attacks is clearly a prominent issue that businesses are concerned with at the moment, and rightly so. I mean, you guys are here, you're attending the webinar, and you are most likely looking at a way to protect your organization from such targeted cyber attacks. And attackers are getting more and more inventive with the techniques that they use to gain access to either sensitive data or gain financial benefit and breach an organization. And you guys want to feel protected, and rightly so. So this brings me on to the fact that there are over 1,000 cybersecurity vendors on the market. Like, surely these vendors should be preventing those data breaches, and the data breaches should actually be decreasing as we see cybersecurity increasing in popularity. However, as you saw, that wasn't the case. Data breaches have increased dramatically. I think it was the 900% mark that we were referring to a couple of slides ago, and it really is the opposite of what you would expect. So it kind of begs the question as to why this is the case. Surely an increasing number of solutions would decrease the number of successful attacks. And the reason behind this is that cybersecurity has always focused on protecting the machine layer. So let's look back to 1990. Firewalls were introduced to protect networks. 2010, endpoint security to protect devices. Now, in the modern day, what seems to be very popular is rule-based solutions to protect email and secure email. However, these cyber incidents like CEO fraud are happening and successful because of people. Let's look at some of these stats briefly. I mean, 90% of data breaches are due to human error. So that machine layer aspect that prior solutions have looked at and really focused on, they seem to only be looking at the 10% of data breaches that are not caused by human error, which seems ludicrous. Like, why would they be doing that if most data breaches are due to human error? Let's also look at the fact that 87% of people see that employees is the biggest security risk at an organization, like not the machine. So again, another reason why it's really important to be looking at the human layer rather than the machine layer. So let's look at CEO fraud now, which is kind of the human layer that needs to be secured. The human layer is the most relevant to CEO fraud and impersonation type of attacks. So yeah, let's look into that. And essentially, CEO fraud is a type of spear phishing attack where attackers impersonate a CEO, a CFO, or another high-level executive. Essentially, these attackers aim to trick the executive's colleagues into carrying out actions that place data, money, and even credentials at risk. So it's a form of BEC, business email compromise. It's just one part of an epidemic of email impersonations that are essentially responsible for billions of dollars in losses all over the world. Collectively, business email compromise scams have essentially been responsible for $26 billion in enterprise losses. So according to the FBI, the latest statistic is between 2018 and 2019, there was an 100% increase in this figure. So that 26 billion is growing exponentially. Now, CEO fraud and other BEC attacks can cause extreme harm to organizations. A particularly common outcome, as with most BEC scams, is to extract money from the business by coercing an employee into making a false wire transfer, a fraudulent wire transfer, acting possibly on a false invoice, which would then be transferred to a cyber criminal controlled bank account. Now, these CEO fraud attacks can also seek to extract sensitive information rather than a specific monetary payload. And this stuff can be like contact data, credentials, and they can even try to infect systems with malware. Now, let's take a look at kind of the specific tactics that are behind CEO fraud. So, how do attackers either get access to this data, get access to this credentials, and get malware into an organization particularly. But most prominently, they aim to get the financial benefit. Now, essentially, CEO fraud, it leverages two key email techniques. Firstly, there's email impersonation, and secondly, there's social engineering. So let's focus on the email impersonation side of things for now. Essentially, email is open access. Anyone can send an email to anyone, right? I mean, let's go back to when email started. Some guy just decided to send spam one day, a couple years after email was invented, and started emailing like 250 people a day or whatever it was back then. And that was like the origins of spam. But this has progressed far more, and this spam has become a far more targeted kind of phishing where they gather intel and then they pretend to be someone else, and they use email to do that. So as with so many email threats, impersonation is at the heart of the attack. So this type of attack most often occurs by either display name impersonation or domain name impersonation. Um, let's firstly look at display name impersonation. So this involves attackers setting a deceptive display name on their email accounts in order to mislead recipients. Essentially, the display name is not part of the email address itself, it's the name affiliated with the account that usually appears before the email address in inboxes. So it's the first thing the person that receives the email will see, and they may not even bother checking whether the actual email address is correct. So this is actually the most easy form of email impersonation and works especially well on mobile devices, as I'll touch upon later, where the actual email address used to send the email is likely to be not visible to the recipient. So now let's look at domain name impersonation. Essentially, this involves attackers spoofing or impersonating an organization's domain in order to appear legitimate. These attackers produce convincing impersonations of a genuine CEO email address in three ways. I'm not going to get into it now, but essentially they either do a root domain impersonation where they change aspects of the company's domain, and an example might be Tessian.com, where they change the S's to fives. Another type is top-level domain name impersonations, and this involves attackers changing the .com to, let's say, .co.uk or .co. And lastly, these attackers could also use subdomains to a completely separate and abstract domain. So, for example, Tessian.outbound.com, something like that. So, on first glance, they would always look legitimate to someone that isn't trained to spot them. So now let's look at how display name impersonation works in practice. So essentially, in this example, we have an attacker pretending to be Sam Jones, and he's attempting to get a finance department to wire money to the attacker's bank account by using a false invoice. And on first glance, this looks ridiculous. As we can see, it comes from a Gmail account made up of random characters. So it's just Sam Jones as the display name, but the email is completely different. It doesn't even look legitimate at all. However, as I mentioned earlier, this type of attack is far more successful on mobile devices, and here you'll see why. So as you can see, if a targeted employee were to view this email on his or her mobile, they would be unable to see the sender's email address, but only their display name. And this is what the attackers mainly rely upon and what they leverage. So they dupe employees into taking actions based on an email that they believe to be entirely legitimate. Now, this attack would most definitely not be picked up by a SEG, a secure email gateway, because it's too far from a single character deviation from the original domain. So essentially, whilst a SEG would pick up a small one character difference, the email address that the attacker is using is far too different. We saw that it was a free mail account at gmail.com. It's nothing like the target domain. Is completely different. So a SEG can definitely not pick that up. Now we'll look at a more advanced technique now, which is domain impersonation, and a specific example of that. So in this example, the attacker has created an email address to look visually similar to the targeted email address. They've added outbound to abcbank.com, as you can see, to make it look legitimate. And in this case, both the display name and domain name arguably do look legitimate, and possibly could fool an employee. Again, this is not protected by SEG, a legacy solution. So these emails are ending up in employees' inboxes if you have one of those in place. So CEO fraud attacks, they basically focus on social engineering as well as the impersonation side of things, and they make requests so convincing by looking at three aspects of the social engineering side. So they leverage trust firstly. So whilst most early spear phishing attacks contain malicious links or attachments, a growing proportion of these attacks they actually contain no payload at all. So this actually has the advantage of being harder for traditional security tools to detect, but sending these innocent, non-fraudulent emails also helps the attacker to build a rapport with the target whilst not being flagged by a system, you know? So a history of regular email communication raises the chances of the target taking the bait when the key malicious email, possibly with the false invoice, gets sent. Social engineering also leverages the urgency kind of aspect of things. You know, if there isn't much time to act on a given request, targets may not think as critically about the motivations behind such request, you know? So by centering the message on time sensitivity, attackers hope that it will force targets to think instinctively and not rationally. So particularly if the message comes from a trusted senior colleague, you know? So finally, seniority, the final part of social engineering and what it kind of leverages. It might sound obvious, but the emphasis on the nature of the CEO or senior executive's work, it can be highly effective in coercing an employee into an action. So emails that ask for work to be done ahead of a board meeting or which appear to be critical to the success and or health of the business, you know, they encourage people to act swiftly just due to the seniority. So essentially, these email techniques make CEO fraud very difficult to defend against if you're only using a basic legacy solution like a secure email gateway. So now we're going to look at how effective they actually are. So enterprises are relying on policies, training, and legacy technology, but we're going to focus on the legacy technology here today. Whilst they do look at the policies and training, these are simply inefficient when it comes to the really targeted spear phishing attacks, because as you can see, they're just getting more and more advanced. So even if you did train your employees, I mean, firstly, with training, there is an issue that it doesn't stick, but also that there is the attacks are just getting so complex that training may not actually prevent them. So we're going to focus actually on the rule-based systems and how these cannot detect advanced impersonation techniques. You know, so essentially, we saw that Sammy Jones in the example was ineffective. The secure email gateway was essentially ineffective due to the attackers changing the email addresses by more than just one character or so. So now we're going to look at what extent can legacy systems actually prevent such techniques. So as you can see here in this example, Sammy.Jones at abcbank.com is the target email address, and everything else, every other possibility is attempts to kind of impersonate that address. Now, a SEG would most likely pick up the first two, you know, the unauthorized two, the one character difference. But look at the abundance of impersonation techniques here that involve more than just one character. And these are more and more common, and attackers know that this will get past a SEG, you know? So essentially, they don't protect against the more advanced systems, the more advanced techniques that attackers are using these days. So in contrast, we'll now look at machine learning and how effective it is in protecting against these attacks. Attackers can be incredibly subtle in crafting their messages to bypass legacy systems, and it is unreasonable to expect busy employees to identify potentially threatening aspects of an email straight away, you know? So that's where our machine learning platform, where it comes into play. You need sophisticated tools that detect the advanced impersonations behind CEO fraud. So how does it work? So essentially, it uses 12 months, our machine learning platform uses 12 months of archival email data to establish what normal looks like. So Tessian understands how people inside and outside a given organization communicate with each other on email. So essentially, by analyzing behaviors and communication patterns, Tessian can identify whether the content of each new email appears to be suspicious or not, and therefore it can detect against the targeted spear phishing that rule-based solutions are unable to. So now let's look at the key takeaways of today. Firstly, we've learned that CEO fraud is powered by advanced impersonation and social engineering. Next, we've learned that the fact that email tactics render secure email gateways and employee training insufficient against as insufficient defenses. Thirdly, CEO fraud can be stopped by machine learning systems that detect even advanced impersonation. Unfortunately, we've actually run out of time, but to those that submitted questions, I'll be following up after this individually. And for those who have questions but didn't actually submit anything, please feel free to contact me via my email, which is actually on the screen. It's nick.rajpal@tessian.com, and I'll get back to you. And on that note, guys, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you found this session really useful. And I really hope to see you guys again soon. Cheers.